I ended up this morning talking about the way in which the liturgy is a paradigm of how a Christian society should be, how the liturgy, as well as being the offering of the propitiatory sacrifice of the Lord's body and blood, is also, in earthly terms, a sign of how a human society should be, with its due ordering, its taxis, its due ordering which enables it to mould, one hopes will enable it to mould the society, the secular society around it. And this afternoon's offering is really a footnote to this morning's, in the sense that I want to choose a particular example of how a society was moulded by a particular form of the Roman rite. And you can take an interest in what I am going to share with you from the point of view of the relationship between liturgy and life, which is a fairly trendy concept, isn't it? Or you could merely enjoy the interest, if you can find some interest, and I can, in what I am going to describe to you. In Belgium, in the 1570s, if you went to a place called Douai, and if you came from Oxford, you would feel quite at home. Because if you had been a student or a head of house or a professor or a vice-chancellor at Oxford in the reign of good Queen Mary, why is it that Elizabeth I is always referred to as Queen Elizabeth I, but they tend to refer to Queen Mary as Mary Tudor? Why is it that she is Bloody Mary while her half-sister is Good Queen Bess? So we shall call her Good Queen Mary. In the days of Good Queen Mary, you walk down the street, the High Street, that lovely curving High Street with the buildings revealing themselves gradually as you walk along it, and you met all your friends. In 1577, you could have much the same experience and meet the same friends in Douai, because after the imposition of Protestantism under Bloody Bess, let's call the other one Bloody Bess, shall we? Good Queen Mary and Bloody Bess. We must reverse these stereotyping Whig impositions upon history. After the imposition of Protestantism, if you had walked down the High Street in Douai, you would have seen many of the same people, especially the distinguished academic names of the Marian reign, the Marian Restoration. Douai was really rather like a second Oxford, not a second Cambridge, because Cambridge had always been a rather Protestant university ever since the invention of Protestantism, but Oxford had remained a place where Protestantism found itself very hard to put down roots. In 1577 at Douai, if you were training for the priesthood there, a quite liturgically significant thing happened. A theologian called Dr. Lawrence Webb arrived from Rome. He had a particular mission. He had a particular job given to him. From December 1576 to April 1577, he taught the seminarians there something that they hadn't learnt before. He taught them the Roman rite according to the newly published edition of St. Pius V. And so, what had they been using before that? Ever since they fled from Oxford to Douai, what had they been worshipping with? Before that, in the reign of Good Queen Mary, what had they been worshipping with? They had been worshipping with the Sarum rite. Except that I don't think we ought to call it the Sarum rite, because that gives the impression that you can have different rites, such as the Byzantine rite, the Roman rite, and the Sarum rite. And that isn't at all correct, because the Sarum rite is properly seen as a dialect of the Roman rite, if you see what I mean. As Adrian Fortescue, the English liturgist in the first third of the 20th century, put it, you shouldn't talk about the Byzantine rite, the Roman rite, and the Sarum rite, because you wouldn't talk about German language, French language, and Yorkshire language, would you? Yorkshire is merely a Yorkshire is merely a dialect of English. The Sarum rite, if you look at the Sarum rite, and perhaps many of you had out of interest, out of curiosity, is very much the Roman rite in all its essential parts and in its essential shape. The things that were different involved things that were quite late in liturgical history, such as the preparation at the foot of the altar, which is a bit different, the prayers when offering the elements at the offertory, the private prayers of the priest before he received communion, they tended to be different. And there were other differences which we could spend a lot of time just listing as if we were considering a laundry list, but that isn't quite what I want to do. So the Sarum rite had moulded the English people for centuries. And when I say the English people, I hope this isn't too imperialist in this setting, it had also moulded the churches of the Pale in Ireland. The Sarum rite was by and large the rite used in the Pale, the area, the anglicised area around Dublin, down the east coast. We are in the Pale here, aren't we? In the County Meath, yes. If you had gone to a celebration of the Sarum rite in an English village in the early years, let's say, of King Henry VIII's reign, you would have found it, in many ways, quite a different experience from the Tridentine Roman rite with which we are familiar. You would have found it different in a way that isn't really demonstrated just by looking at the books. If you just look at the books, you'll say, oh, well, yeah, that prayer's the same, that prayer's the same, that prayer's the same. As I said a moment ago, you get a sort of laundry list of little differences here and little differences there. The cultural experience of the Sarum rite was quite vividly different. And, for example, even nowadays, if you go to a Latin Mass Society event and there is a solemn high Mass in the, according to the books of 1962, or even, as it sometimes happens, according to books which are earlier than 1962, but perhaps you'll excise that from the tape you're making, brother. There will be a general communion. Even when I was an undergraduate at Oxford in the 1960s, early 1960s, a general communion at a high Mass was very, very unusual. For example, I went commonly to those Anglican churches in which everything was modelled exactly and precisely upon what happened in the Catholic Church. I went to a church called St. Mary Magdalene's in Oxford, and the liturgy there, parts of it were in English, but it was the Tridentine High Mass that I went to on Sundays. And High Mass was at 10:30. At 10:20, one of the clergy came out in a cotter and a stole, accompanied by a server, and went into the Blessed Sacrament chapel, and there the Blessed Sacrament was distributed from the tabernacle to those who wished to receive communion. And then the High Mass proceeded from beginning to end without a general communion. And just across the road there was another great Anglo-Catholic centre where liturgy was done superbly well, High Mass at 11:30. There again, there was no communion at all for the laity. They were told that if they wanted to go to communion, they could have gone to their college chapel earlier on a Sunday morning. As late as 1965, a general communion at a High Mass was very, very unusual. Nowadays, even if you are a dyed-in-the-wool traddy, even if you are one of Archbishop Lefebvre's disciples, a High Mass without the distribution of Holy Communion would just seem peculiar, wouldn't it? And if a man, I think we're going to consider the liturgical reactions of a man from Mars. If a man from Mars were to go to a traddy High Mass nowadays, perhaps the thing that he would notice most, because it's when all the congregation moves, or most of them, the thing he'd notice most would be that act of general communion, wouldn't he? If a man from Mars went to a Sarum celebration in the late Middle Ages, he wouldn't have seen that at all, unless he happened to hit upon Easter Sunday. The man from Mars wouldn't come away from a Sarum High Mass saying that the most striking visual thing about it was all the people pouring forth. Back a bit now from 1577 to 1549. In 1549, Whit Sunday was a very significant day and a highly disastrous day. On Whit Sunday in 1549, an Act of Parliament came into effect by which the Sarum rite was abolished, by which it was replaced by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's first English communion service, which was actually very much like a Sarum rite. It was in English, but the shape of it and the ritual was very similar to Sarum. If you were a deaf mute, you probably wouldn't have noticed much difference between the Sarum rite and Dr. Cranmer's first English Eucharistic order. Except 1549, Whit Sunday, the people, particularly in the west of England, Devon and Cornwall, and Oxfordshire also, flooded out of church, and they decided to make their views known to their parish priest. They had just experienced the English Eucharistic order of the Protestant prayer book for the first time, and they didn't like it. They didn't like it one little bit, and a great rebellion spread across the west of England, often called the Great Western Rebellion. Everywhere, laity, instinctively wishing to practice actuosa participatio, explained to their parish clergy that they did not wish that he should do this anymore. They expressed a very strong desire, I'm sure in the politest terms that the laity can ever use, that their parish priest, whatever the Act of Parliament said, should return to the Sarum rite first thing on Monday morning. There were one or two unpleasant little incidents. In one place, a local farmer who was a bit keen on keeping in with the government protested and put the contrary point of view, but the worthy and admirable peasants of Devon hacked him to pieces with their agricultural implements, and there wasn't much dissent after that. As they gathered strength as they spread their views, they put together some articles, their demands of the government. And these articles are very revealing. And then they got even more strength. They got even more strength when a man called Walter Raleigh. Now, if you were my generation and an Englishman, Walter Raleigh would betoken heroic English sailors going out and defeating the Spanish Armada and the Golden Hind going around the world and that sort of thing. One of the great heroes of English naval history. Perhaps I should take this opportunity to admit that my father's profession was that of a British naval officer. But the Walter Raleigh I'm talking about now, 1549, was Sir Walter Raleigh's father, but just as unwholesome an individual as Sir Walter Raleigh II was. And he found a Corpus Christi, Feast of Corpus Christi, he found a woman going to Mass, and in those days, gentlewomen, middle-class women, had a rosary hanging from their girdle, and she was going to Mass, saying her rosary as she went, as one might, and he stopped her and harangued her and told her what the government was going to be doing to people like her. And she then went on to her parish church and told them all, and that helped to give the rebellion even more oomph. Those articles, the 15 articles which the rebels put together, it's very interesting. The articles of us, the commoners of Devonshire and Cornwall, in divers camps by east and west of Exeter. First, we will have the general council and holy decrees of our forefathers observed, kept, and performed, and whosoever shall again say them, we hold them as heretics. So they get down to the real point, the nub of the issue, they're heretics straight away. No point about beating around the bush, is there? Anybody who disagrees with us is a heretic. Good. Item. We will have the laws of our sovereign Lord King Henry VIII concerning the 6 articles to be in use again, as in his time they were. In other words, they want to go back. This is what they're saying. They want to go back to the time when Henry VIII had broken with the Pope, but he hadn't changed the worship and the teaching in the parish churches. Henry VIII was never a Protestant. He just believed that he should be Pope. 3. Item. We will have the Mass in Latin as was before, and celebrated by a priest, without any man or woman communicating with him. In other words, they didn't want any of that newfangled stuff. And a bit later, when they come to describe Dr. Cranmer's communion service, number 8. Item. We will not receive the new service because it is but like a Christmas game. But we will have our old service of matins, mass, evensong, and procession in Latin as it was before. Back to item 4. Item. We will have the sacrament hang over the high altar. Now, in good Queen Mary's time, when the Archbishop of Canterbury was Cardinal Poole, there had been a move to have tabernacles put into the churches, to reserve the Blessed Sacrament in a tabernacle such as we are familiar with nowadays, or were until the 1970s. But in many parts of England, in the country areas, that hadn't stuck, and the sacrament was still reserved in a pyx that hung from the ceiling with a silk drapery over it. We will have the sacrament hang over the high altar, and there to be worshipped as it was wont to be. And they which will not thereto consent, good bit here coming, we will have them die like heretics against the holy Catholic faith. Item. We will have the sacrament of the altar but at Easter delivered to the lay people, and then but in one kind. Item. Baptism. They want baptism to be available every day of the week, whereas there had been a rumour going around that the government would forbid it on any day except Sundays. Item, we will have holy bread and holy water made every Sunday. Oh? Holy water? Yes, we can understand that, because if we are a tradie, then we know about the asperges. Indeed, in the Novus Ordo, there is the asperges available, isn't there, as a rite of penitence. Making holy water and then sprinkling, but holy bread. We will have holy bread and holy water made every Sunday. And they go on to say they want palms and ashes as well, because at the end of Mass, the priest, during the last Gospel, blessed bread, which was then distributed in the same way that in Byzantine churches, the Antidoron is distributed at the end of the Holy Eucharist to everybody who is present and wishes to receive it. They want prayers for the souls in purgatory. Item, we will have the Bible and all books of Scripture in English to be called in again, for we be informed that otherwise the clergy shall not of long time confound the heretics. The distribution of English Bibles in parish churches, they thought, had not been a progressive move. Item, we will have Dr. Mormon and Dr. Crispin, which hold our opinions. They want 2 theologians of theirs who were imprisoned in the Tower of London to be sent. They also say that they want at least one of the abbeys in each county to be restored. They're not asking too much, because of course there are big financial interests in the abbey, in the monastery grounds, which had been sold off by Henry VIII. They didn't want to have too much in the way of opposition to their demands. So they merely ask that one abbey in each county be restored. Since 1533, the Pope had been unpopular in English government circles. Henry VIII broke England from Rome for various reasons, but he broke it. They don't say, the rebels, we want the Pope's jurisdiction back. What they are mainly concerned with is to get back the old religion that they had in their parish churches on the Saturday before Whitsunday. But notice this crafty bit. Item, we think it very meet, because the Lord Cardinal Poole is of the King's blood, should not only have his pardon, but also be sent for to Rome and promoted to be of the King's council. In other words, they are not asking for the repeal of the anti-papal laws, but they are asking for somebody, Cardinal Poole, spelt Pole, of course, Cardinal Poole, to come back from England and be part of the government, even though he had written a book on the unity of the Church, which so enraged Henry VIII that he had Cardinal Poole's mother, the Countess of Salisbury, executed. There are various editions of these articles that they produced. We will have the Lord Cardinal Pole sent back. He should have his pardon. The next edition of the articles should have his free pardon. And they ask that he be promoted to be of the King's council. In their next edition of the articles, to be first or second of the King's council. In other words, they were going for Cardinal Poole, later of course to be Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor of England. They were going for him to be made what we would call the Prime Minister. They don't want any gentleman to have more servants than he should have. They were tired of being bullied. They want some restoration made of the abbey lands and also of the chantry lands. We'll come back to the Western Rebellion shortly. So If a general communion of the entire congregation, or most of it, was not the most striking visual feature of the Sarum Mass, what was? Well, you've heard some of it already. The procession. Before Mass, there was the blessing of water and then a procession. But unlike our modern Tridentine, our modest, rather stingy, rather unimaginative Asperges procession, when the priest, some clergy only just stand at the front of the church and flick a bit of water around, don't they? Even the more active clergy only go down the church and then up again, flicking water at the people as they go. In the Middle Ages, in the Sarum rite, it was much more than that. The priest also sprinkled all the altars in the church, which would have been endowed by different families and maintained by different families. They went outside into the churchyard and they sprinkled all the graves of all the families. Just think what that theologically means. It's a profound piece of theology. It brings into a union the present generation, all the families of the parish, and also past generations. There's that rather interesting distinction, isn't there, between synchronic unity and diachronic unity. Well, it brings about the synchronic unity of all the families in the parish at the moment, and it also brings past generations, diachronic, into unity. The water was also taken home by common folk to be used in the households to banish devils and ensure blessing. The importance of this blessing and distribution is indicated by the fact that in many cases the parish clerk's wages were linked to it, and he was called the holy water clerk. In other words, he is the chappie who went in front of the parish priest with the holy water bucket. So the man from Mars, to whom I introduced you 10 minutes ago, he would have noticed, he couldn't have failed to notice on a Sunday morning in medieval England, that very significant procession. The second thing that the man from Mars would have noticed would have been the bidding of the beads. This was a solemn form of prayer in English, which took place after the offertory, and the priest from the pulpit, or sometimes from the rood screen, called on the people to pray for the Pope, the bishops, the clergy, their own priest, for the king, the lords, and the commons, for the mayor, other authorities in the local community. Thus, it's a form of prayer which again bespeaks synchronic unity between us here and Christian people throughout the world. Prayer for pilgrims, travellers, those in special need, prisoners, women with child. And finally, they prayed for the household, which was on the rota that week to prepare the Holy Loaf, the basis of another parochial rite, the blessing and distribution of the Holy Bread after Mass. And then in the second part of the bidding prayer, the congregation prayed for the departed, especially the dead of that parish. Here the diachronic unity coming in again. Recently deceased parishioners, special benefactors of the church, those on the parish bead roll, they were all prayed for. It may not be the sort of liturgical experience that we are familiar with its lack of a general communion of the congregation, but it spoke a very clear language about the Christian unity between all Christians at this moment of time and all Christians throughout history, all Christians, in other words, incorporated into the body of Christ from the beginning until now. It was also when, from time to time, they paid their dues to the clergy. The third thing that I think the man from Mars would have noticed would have been the elevation of the host. not so much was made of the elevation of the chalice, which was a much later development. The elevation of the host was very important, and it was very important that a man, a woman, should see it. They desired, as they very correctly, in theological terms, put it, looking upon my God. In fact, the English were notorious throughout Europe for going to Mass, very, very many of them daily, with the cry that they didn't wish to embark upon the day without setting eyes upon their God. And sometimes you can see holes drilled in rood screens in English churches so that people could see through the holes to the elevation, or little slits through walls so that people in side chapels could see the elevation. And there are stories about priests, perhaps, who were a little bit shy about raising the host high enough for everybody to see, and they would be shouted at, "Raise higher! Heave higher, Sir Priest! Heave higher!" They would cry. It was important to them. So a man from Mars, I think, would have noticed that. Perhaps the most striking thing that the man from Mars would also notice would have been shortly after the consecration, when the pax, the peace, was exchanged. Not as nowadays, when people turn to each other and shake hands. I always think that's a very unhygienic habit, don't you, in an age like our own, where people receive communion into the hand. At the peace, they shake hands with people who've been coughing and sneezing into their hands, and then they go up to the altar and receive the host onto the palms of their hands and proceed to consume it. I'm surprised we don't get more health problems from that. It wasn't like that in the Sarum rite. In the Sarum rite there was a thing called the pax, which could have been made of base metal or even of wood, but it was often made of silver. Some of them have survived. And after the consecration, before the communion, the priest at the Pax Domini sit semper Viscum picked it up and kissed it, and it was then passed around. Called Pax Breed. It probably had on it carved the Lamb of God or the crucifix, and it was then taken by one of the ministers, or in a small parish by the clerk, to the congregation outside the rood screen, where it was kissed by each in turn, once more observing seniority. I was talking this morning about taxes, due order, people in their respective orders. That was expressed in many ways, sometimes disastrously, by the pax. Those of a certain order got to kiss the pax before those considered to be of a lower order. And there is some evidence surviving of what happened. In 1513, Thomas Rode and William Morton at Astbury in Cheshire quarrelled ferociously concerning which of them should sit highest in church and which should foremost go in procession. And similarly, in 1494, the Wardens of the parish of All Saints, Stanning, presented Joanna Diachronic for breaking the Pax Breed by throwing it on the ground, because another woman of the parish had kissed it before her. In other words, she was concerned with her status. She thought, we don't know whether she was right or not after this lapse of time, but she thought that taxes, she might not have used the word taxes, but she thought that due taxes had been infringed. On All Saints' Day in 1522, Master John Brown of the parish of Thoyden Gernon in Essex, having kissed the Pax Breed at parish mass, smashed it over the head of Richard Pond, the holy water clerk who had offered it to him, causing streams of blood to run to the ground. Brown was enraged because the Pax had first been offered to Francis Hampden, the patron of the living, in other words, the squire, and his wife Marjorie, despite the fact that the previous Sunday he had warned Pond, "Clerk, if thou hereafter givest not me the Pax first, I shall break it on thy head." The Pax. And finally, the distribution of holy bread, blessed bread, after Mass. Your man from Mars would probably have noticed that. And sometimes the holy bread, the blessed bread, was also taken away for family use. Let's go back to the Western Rebellion, the great Western Rebellion of 1549. The rebels got to the main city in the west of England called Exeter. They found it very difficult to take Exeter. They'd had no trouble taking the less well-defended cities, but Exeter was an ancient city, indeed with Roman walls, and it was not so easy to capture. They therefore besieged it with camps all around. The camps, they kept themselves warm in the evenings by having big bonfires, and what they burnt on the bonfires were the books of common prayer, which they had been forced by the government earlier in the year to buy for a shilling each in order to be used in their churches. Those books were now brought along and were burnt on fires, and so Exeter was besieged. One of the leaders of the siege was the parish priest of the Church of St. Thomas the Martyr just outside Exeter. In medieval England, churches of St. Thomas the Martyr were very often outside city walls, for the reason that St. Thomas the Martyr is quite a late saint, isn't he? He's not one of the biblical saints, not one of the early saints. Therefore, my church at Oxford was St. Thomas the Martyr, and was outside the city walls, and at Exeter, St. Thomas the Martyr was outside the city walls. And the parish priest there was a man called Sir Robert Welsh. That doesn't mean he was a knight, by the way. Medieval clergy were known either as Master Smith or Sir John Smith. Master, if you were a Master of Arts of one of the universities or had a doctorate. In other words, you were a graduate. And if you didn't have if you didn't have a degree, you were a non-graduate priest, then you were called Sir. Sir Robert Welsh. We know a bit about Sir Robert Welsh because an account was made of the siege of Exeter. And it was made by a Protestant, which means that the good things he says about Sir Robert Welsh must be true. He's not biased in Robert Welsh's favour. In other words, he's, as far as he has a bias, he's biased against him. And this is how Folkes, the Protestant historian, describes him. He had many good things in him. He was of no great stature, but well set and mightily compact. He was a very good wrestler, shot well, both in the long bow as also in the crossbow. He handled his handgun and piece very well. He was a very good woodman, that means he was good at hunting, and a hardy, and such a one as would not give his head for the polling. In other words, you didn't tangle with him without regretting that you had done so. Lovely phrase, don't you think? He would not give his head for the polling. I think the clergy among us could bring that into parochial use when we're gossiping about our parishioners to other clergy, couldn't we? Oh, Mrs. So-and-so, she wouldn't give you her head for polling. Nor his beard for the washing. He was a companion in any exercise and activity, and of a courteous and gentle behaviour. He also had persuaded the rebels not to do something that many of them wanted to do, which was to fire heated cannon into the city. In other words, to create a fire in the city in order to break down its defences, which would, of course, led to many deaths. Sir Robert Welsh is given credit by the Protestant historian for having prevented that from happening. Well, modern historians tell us that the Great Western Rebellion was put down by the Tudor government in what, in modern terms, we would call a genocide. The estimates are that something like a third of the population were killed in the areas particularly affected by the rebellion. In one town, for example, the royal troops arrived. Not English royal troops. The Tudor government couldn't rely upon English soldiers to do what needed to be done. In other words, slaughtering their fellow countrymen. So they brought in German and Italian mercenaries who would do anything for the money. One town, Bodmin, they got to Bodmin, and the rebels had fled, and the mayor of Bodmin, who had been a very keen backer of the rebellion, he had not fled, and he thought he'd better try to make his amends with the government. So he went to the leader of this army and invited him to dinner. Rather chillingly, the general, who was a man called Lord Russell, modern descendant, has a house called Woburn Abbey, the Duke of Bedford, and invited him to supper. And Russell said, yes, and he smiled at him and was very, very friendly, and the mayor thought that perhaps things weren't going to be too bad. Russell said, before, can I ask you to do something for me? Would you have a big gallows built there? And so while they ate their supper together, there was the sound of carpenters creating this big gallows. You can see how this story is going to end, can't you? And so after supper, they went out, and Russell said to the mayor, now you've been a busy rebel, and now you must pay for it. And so the mayor was strung up on his own gallows. There was a particular game that they played, which was that of hanging the clergy from their own towers, the clergy who had taken part in the rebellion. This was really an extremely unpleasant put-down, because there had also been rebellions elsewhere in England. The Tudor regime was not very strong. As you know, Henry VIII had left 2 daughters, and England was not accustomed to being ruled by women, had left 2 daughters and 1 rather sickly son, who in fact died very soon after these events. And in any case, the Tudor family had no right whatsoever, in law, to have the throne of England. They were usurpers. Henry VII had simply seized the crown from the Plantagenets by force. And going back to those articles, Article 12, we think it very meet because the Lord Cardinal Pole is of the King's blood. Cardinal Pole was of the King's blood. In fact, Cardinal Pole was closer to the throne in terms of law and legality than the Tudors were. It's not surprising, therefore, that the Tudors didn't like Pole anyway, even if Pole hadn't gone abroad, even if he hadn't written a book attacking Henry VIII for breaking the unity of the Church. The Poles would not have been very popular. Henry VIII spent most of his reign executing anybody who had more Plantagenet royal blood in their veins than he did. They were worried. That rebellion, you see, had come very near to succeeding. That rebellion, combined with other rebellions in other parts of England, and indeed in some parts of England which were Protestant, there were rebellions which were stoked by agrarian discontents about the economic state of the countryside under the Tudor government. So what with one thing and another, these were worrying days for the Tudor regime. And we look back. It's easy to look at history the wrong way round, isn't it? We look back and we know what happened. There was an enormously long reign of Elizabeth Tudor, and she presided over an England which has gone down romanticised in the English historical myth, not happily in the Irish historical myth, because the Irish are much more sensible about things like the Tudors. If you look at it from how things actually must have seemed in 1549, the Tudor government could easily have been overthrown, and there were enough people with more royal blood than the Tudors to provide somebody who would have been put on the throne, and the Lord Cardinal Poole would have been to the head in doing so. I don't think he would have been King of England himself because he was in holy orders, but, well, they were worried. That's why they were so vicious. That is why a genocide had to happen. And indeed it happened, the same thing happened in the 1560s, when there was a great northern rebellion against Protestantism under Elizabeth. And likewise, the government just lost its head and behaved in what nowadays we call a genocidal way. After the rebellion had therefore been put down by Lord Russell and his foreign mercenaries, people had to die, and among the people who had to die was, of course, Father Robert Welsh. This is the account of his execution by the same Protestant historian. The execution of this man was committed to Bernard Duffield, who, being nothing slack to follow his commission. The Protestant historian folks did have a sympathy for the Catholic priest Welsh. He wasn't really very impressed by this man Duffield's enthusiasm to do the execution. Was committed to Bernard Duffield, who, being nothing slack to follow his commission, caused a pair of gallows. I don't know why, but you never talk about a gallows in medieval English. It's always a pair of gallows, even if you've only got one gallows with only one noose on it. A pair of, similarly with rosary. A rosary is called a pair of beads. Don't ask me why. Caused a pair of gallows to be made and to be set up upon the top of the tower of the said vicar's parish church of St. Thomas. And all things being ready, and the stage perfected for this tragedy, the vicar was brought to the place, and by a rope about his middle, drawn up to the top of the tower, and there in chains, hanged in his popish apparel, means his mass vestments. And notice the next bit, which goes back to what I was saying earlier about the man from Mars, what the man from Mars would have noticed. In his popish apparel, and having a holy water bucket, a sprinkler, a sacring bell, a pair of beads, and such other like popish trash hanged about him. In other words, dangling from the chains that he was being hanged from. And there he, with the same about him, remained a long time. He made a very small or no confession, but very patiently took his death. He had been a good member in his commonwealth, had not the weeds overgrown the good corn, and his foul vices overcomed his virtues. The Protestant believes that the Catholic priest was really a good bloke, except that he was Catholic. That is what the religious experience of the laity in medieval England was on a Sunday. The procession, bringing the whole of the community, living and departed, into one unity, the bidding of the beads, doing the same, the sharing of the peace, the pax, saying something about due taxes within the community, and a similar point, I think, being made by the distribution of the holy bread. On weekdays, the church would not be empty. As I said earlier, the English had a reputation throughout Europe for being keen churchgoers on weekdays. And by the way, church-going does not simply mean the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Remember Article 8. We will not receive the new service because it is but like a Christmas game, but we will have our old service of matins, Mass, evensong, and procession in Latin, as it was before. On weekdays, you'd see a lot of lay people at evensong, that is to say, vespers with compline tacked on in the evening. In the morning, you would have the chantry masses being said. People would found a chantry, which meant that there was land attached to it, which meant that there was an endowment, a stipend, for a priest to say Mass every morning in that chantry chapel for those for whom he was employed to pray, for the departed, for whom he was employed to pray. And after Mass, he would then probably go off and make a bit more cash, because they were not wealthy men, the chantry clergy, by teaching schoolboys in the parish. And the English educational system depended largely upon having chantry clergy who were prepared to deliver elementary education in English towns and villages up and down the country. If you know England very well, you will know that in quite a lot of the larger towns there are schools called the Royal Grammar School in such and such a place. And it's been well said that these royal grammar schools, which were all founded by the Tudors, were not the schools which the Tudors founded. They were those which the Tudors didn't suppress. In other words, if you had a school which was staffed by the chantry clergy and the education was given by them, once the Tudor government had suppressed the chantries and grabbed the endowments for itself, obviously the schools had really a quite considerable problem. And in order to ensure that there wasn't too much local resentment, in a number of places the Tudor government founded a grammar school with some of the endowments from some of the chantries in order to keep education going and in order to keep the population moderately quiet. The clergy in medieval England were not the sort of professional caste which they have been since Cardinal Poole invented the seminary system. Did you know that it was Cardinal Poole who invented the seminary system that the Council of Trent then imposed upon the whole Catholic Church? It's not commonly known. One of Cardinal Poole's secretaries, a man called Dr. Richard Owen, was later the secretary of St. Charles Borromeo and played a large role in encouraging him in the movement to put up seminaries. In medieval England, anybody who went along to a bishop and could read and asked for ordination was ordained. The seminary system, Cardinal Poole's seminary system. The clergy in medieval England were rather like the Greek Orthodox parochial clergy nowadays. They were not people of high academic qualifications, although there were among them those who were indeed graduates and had high qualifications. But many of the parochial clergy, such as Sir Robert Welch, had not had a university education, had not had a seminary education. The modern Greek Orthodox parish church, parish priest in Greece, unless things have changed since I was there in the 60s and 70s, he's not a university man, he's not a graduate usually, he's a married man, and he keeps his small holding, and he feeds his hens, and he makes sure that his pig is happy, and when required to celebrate the sacraments he does so. He doesn't have to say the divine office, that's a thing only for the monastic clergy, and they don't say it with quite the regularity that we devoted clergy in the West do. Just as in Greece, I think a generation ago, the clergy were part of village life in a way that's very difficult for us to understand in the West. So it was in medieval England. I mean, in the Church of England, until a generation ago, the clergy were gentry. The clergy were regarded as and they regarded themselves as being gentry. And a benefice with its income was, in Jane Austen, something that a gentleman would seek to have, and he'd be ordained. He would be ordained so that he could accept a living. If his father had a living, then the father, if he was a nobleman or a gentleman, would expect his eldest son to take on the family business of running the state. Younger sons might seek a career in the army, or in law, or in the church. Parish clergy, Anglican parish clergy, before the 1800s, were not particularly religious people. Again, if you read Jane Austen, if you read Northanger Abbey, for example, there is that nice young man, Mr. Tilney, who finally marries the heroine, doesn't he? Because most of Jane Austen's books end up happily ever after. He marries the heroine, but for most of the narrative, the Reverend Henry Tilney seems to be pursuing the ladies in Bath just as any other gentleman would. And if you read the text carefully, there's no suggestion that he dressed in a distinctive way either. In the Catholic Church, since the Reformation, since Cardinal Poole's invention of seminaries caught on and was imposed by the papacy, a priest is a man who has been trained for 7 years in a seminary. I wonder if it was always quite like that in Ireland during the penal days. I bet exceptions were made, but that tends to be the rule, isn't it? 7 years. 7 years is a long time. Professionalization of the clergy is something that the medieval church didn't have in the same way. In other words, as in the Orthodox churches nowadays, the lower clergy, as we might call them, were much more integrated into society, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why celibacy didn't always catch on in all places with equal security throughout the Middle Ages. So that is what church life was like, and that is what the Eucharist was like in medieval England until the very eve of the Reformation. And I'd like to draw out of it the points that I alluded to earlier, that this says something about the way in which a society should be formed if it is a Christian society, with due taxes, with people having their sense of their role in society. Clergy, they are an estate. The clergy in England, the Anglican clergy, continued in the old medieval style. The clergy taxed themselves until about 1715. In other words, the clergy didn't pay tax as set by Parliament. They paid the tax that they agreed with the government via their convocations. In London, York, Exeter, Dublin, great English cities, there were the guilds, where all the fish sellers had a fish sellers guild. It was a guild society where each guild, the shoemakers, the merchant tailors, you name it, they had their guilds in which they maintained prices, and they maintained standards, and they maintained the system of apprenticeship by which people joined the guild. In a humble parish, I'm thinking of one parish in Cornwall where the medieval stained glass survived the Reformation, and there's a complete set in every window of medieval glass, and you know who gave the glass in that window because they're at the bottom. Because in a medieval parish there were innumerable guilds. The guild of the women in the west part of the parish, the guild of the young maidens in the east part of the parish, the guild of the young men, as well as some of the trade guilds. Even young maidens, that is to say probably girls under the age of 14, after which they would be married off, they actually had their guild and their finances, and they elected their own wardens. And the parish was then run as a whole by what Anglicans now call the church wardens, of whom there are two, who are the senior lay people in a parish and run it with the parish priest. And a very good system too. My church wardens accompanied me into the ordinariate, both splendid people. But all these guilds, they had, just think of 12, 13, 14-year-old girls electing their own wardens, running their own finances of their guild, that sort of thing. Parish life, city life, town life, parish life was a much more corporate thing than anything that we know nowadays in our post-industrial revolution, itemized, atomized, individualized setup, where so many people live in estates, dormitory estates, one by one, rows of houses or bungalows, and go into work in separate places each day. We live in a society which finds taxis, the due ordering of things, to be rather difficult. We are in a society where we are all individuals warring with each other rather than individuals who know our order, know where we fit into the jigsaw of society. The Eucharist, in my view, as well as being a propitiatory sacrifice, is a thing that points to a paradigm, a model that points to an ordered society. I don't know whether human beings will ever get back to secular societies which are ordered. There are one or two slight hints of that sort of society. Fathers, has the Irish Senate been abolished yet? They're planning to still, are they? Do you think? There were plans to abolish it. Yeah. The Irish Senate, not like the House of Lords in England, the Irish Senate had the representation of particular interests in it. That's what made it interesting. It was representation of the people, but not like the representation of the constituencies, where it's the constituency electing the member, but representation of interest groups in society. It's a system sometimes called Corporatism. And it was given rather a bad name because Mussolini was quite keen on it, which I think is a shame. But who knows? The English House of Lords, of course, in a sense was a bit the same, in as far as people who had a particular basis in society were part of it. The lords who owned the land and had the power, the bishops, the judges, that sort of thing. And I know this is terribly old-fashioned, but I am not convinced that a corporate approach to government is entirely and inconceivable way of running a state. But that would be to get into politics. What I want to leave you with is a theological vision of society destined in the will of God to be transformed by the Eucharist into something which visibly models the Eucharist.